So tonight we're going to talk about Tarleton's Charlottesville raid, which is somewhat of an obscure subject. It's part of the bigger picture of the Yorktown campaign, but I began doing research on this event about 25 years ago. Have published several articles and a book that contains most of this. And there's a lot of good information, a lot of interesting episodes. And the reason why I got interested in it was that there's a lot of big names in this episode. You have, of course, Thomas Jefferson. You have Lord Cornwallis. There's the Marquis de Lafayette. There's Bannister Tarleton, who most of you have kind of heard of. If not, you will hear a lot more about him tonight. There's also someone named Daniel Boone involved in this story. So, and George Washington as well. So we're going to be kind of focusing on a small 2 or 3 day raid in Virginia prior to Yorktown, but it could have had very big implications. We're also going to be doing a lot of maps and images, so you won't see me much, but till the end, but you will see a lot of the terrain. And again, one more thing I'll say is one of the more interesting parts of this story is that it happens between Richmond and Charlottesville, and a lot of the locations, the sites, the roads, the camps, the houses, the taverns, a lot of them are still standing, and you can take the drive to follow along with Tarleton and Jack Jewett, who we'll introduce in a few minutes, and a lot of the terrain is still the same. So let's get a little bit of background here. Liz, let's go to the next slide. This episode happened during the campaign in Virginia in 1781. This was a campaign in which the British under Lord Cornwallis brought several thousand men into Virginia from North Carolina in May of 1781. And his goal was to reduce Virginia, meaning to destroy as many of the supplies, the logistical support areas, the depots, any troops, militia. And the reason he wanted to do that is because he had fought in South Carolina and North Carolina since May of 1780. And he realized, or thought he knew, that until Virginia was knocked out of the war logistically and politically and institutionally, that the Continental Army in the South would always have a logistical base. And so he was coming to Virginia really to wipe that out. And his force initially was about 4,000 men. He joined up with another British force at Petersburg under General Phillips in mid-May of 1781. Phillips had approximately 1,400 or 1,500 men, but he had died about a week before Cornwallis arrived in Petersburg. So Cornwallis consolidated two armies, sent some of the troops back to Portsmouth, Virginia, which was a British base at the time. He knew he faced a very small force in Virginia led by the Marquis de Lafayette, who you see on the right. Lafayette had come down to Virginia by April of 1781 with about 1,000 New England and New Jersey Continental light troops, and that was gonna form the core of the Continental resistance in Virginia. And Lafayette was going to rely on the Virginia militia to bolster his forces, but they were very unreliable, and he could rarely count on them. He was also counting on about 1,000 Pennsylvania Continentals under General Mad Anthony Wayne coming down from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Lafayette expected him in April or May to march down, so he was trying to join up with Lafayette in Virginia. But it's important to remember that Cornwallis had a much stronger force than Lafayette, and Lafayette had to be very, very cautious about letting Cornwallis get too close to him or use his cavalry force under Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton to attack. So that was always Lafayette's main concern. let's go to the next slide and we'll see a map that I put some overlays on. And you'll see that what we have here is Cornwallis at the bottom of your screen there, coming from Petersburg. And he decided that he was going to cross the James River to try to flank Lafayette out of his position. Now, Lafayette was south of Richmond on the left bank of the river, and he had a position in Henrico County in order to block the road, the direct road to Richmond, by taking up a position near 4 Mile Creek in order to try to block Cornwallis's troops. However, Cornwallis, as you can see on the map, headed east to the right on your map and crossed the James River at a narrow point near Westover Plantation. That's on the James River. It's in Charles City County. It was the seat of the Byrd family. We'll show you a picture of it in a second here. But he crossed the river and headed up along the road that went along the river to Malvern Hill, which I've pointed out on the map with an X. And many of you know Malvern Hill from the famous July 1st, 1862 Civil War battle there that was part of the 7 Days Battles. But it was a very high area. It was up off the river. It was considered healthy. And that's where Cornwallis was headed to try to get the high ground for his troops, but also to outflank Lafayette in Richmond. Now, what Lafayette wound up doing for the majority of this campaign was he always wanted some natural obstacle between himself and the British. And in this part of Virginia, that meant a river. And what we'll see is that Lafayette will retreat to the next river ahead of Cornwallis, so that they were rarely on the same side of the river, of any river in central Virginia, in the Piedmont and Tidewater, because he knew that Cornwallis outnumbered him, and if he was caught too slow or without the natural obstacle of some watercourse, that he was going to be in trouble. So you can also see on the top right of the map where Bottom's Bridge is, Cornwallis crossed there as well. Those of you who know the area, that's where US 60, the Williamsburg Road, crosses over the Chickahominy River and eventually goes over to Williamsburg. That's where Cornwallis and his troops crossed. And finally, you can see they were headed toward Hanover Courthouse in Hanover County, Virginia, not far from today's Ashland, Virginia. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is an image of Westover Plantation. As you can see, not too swanky there. It is swanky there. This was built in the 1750s, still stands today. You can tour the grounds of the house if you're ever out that way below Richmond. And that's where the British camped for about a day after they crossed from the south side of the James River to the north side of the James River. And this plantation house is on the north side of the James River. And they pursued the road up toward Richmond. And as I said, they went toward Malvern Hill. And if we can get the next slide. This is a 1920s or 30s image of the actual house that was at Malvern Hill. It is no longer standing. It's a late 17th, early 18th century structure. It sat up on the high ground near where the battlefield is. The battlefield is now owned by the National Park Service, and they've actually expanded it quite a bit with a recent acquisition of several hundred acres. But this is where Cornwallis's troops would have at least paused for a short period of time. Lafayette would later come back there himself just before the Yorktown campaign. And if we'll go to the next slide, we will see Hanover Courthouse. Built in 1735, it is still standing, used occasionally It's a very beautiful structure, very picturesque next to the side of the road. It's in the town of Hanover Courthouse, or what more modernly known as Hanover, just east of I-95, and folks can see this near Ashland, Virginia. But this was a commonly known place. It's not too far from the North Anna River and the South Anna River, where they combine. So Cornwallis came to this area and camped nearby for about one day. Okay, let's go to our next map. And on the next map here, we're a little above Hanover. Hanover slightly south. This is a Civil War map, so excuse me, don't be alarmed by the railroads. This is one of the Hotchkiss, Jed Hotchkiss Confederate topographical maps. And the British had come from Hanover Courthouse, and they made their way to Cook's Ford, which you can see on the map, and that's on the North Anna River. And those of you who are Civil War students and scholars and enthusiasts will know that as Ox Ford, which became very prominent at the Battle of North Anna in 1864. But the British made their way to Ox Ford from Hanover, and the cavalry was sent across the river to explore a little bit into Caroline County, which is across the river. That didn't by this time Lafayette had retreated pretty far north of the North Anna River to try to stay out of the British Army's way. And here at Cook's Ford, the British stayed for some time. They were getting close to Fredericksburg, which was a major supply area, and they also had two forges that repaired and made weapons, made swords, camp kettles, repaired a lot of equipment, and that was called Hunter's Iron Works. And there was a small forge there that the state ran called Rappahannock Forge. And originally, Lafayette thought that that's where Cornwallis was headed. So Lafayette, from this area here that you see in Hanover, he started retreating toward Fredericksburg, hoping that he would be able to defend it. Now, while the British were here on June 2nd, Cornwallis decided that because Lafayette had retreated so far to the north, that he now was going to move to the west towards Charlottesville and what's now modern Scottsville in Albemarle County on the James River, to destroy some very important American supply depots at Charlottesville, at a place called Point of Fork, which I'll show you later. That's now known as Columbia, Virginia, and near Scottsville at a place which is now basically gone, called Old Albemarle Courthouse. It was the first courthouse in Albemarle County prior to the establishment of Charlottesville in the 1760s. So he decided that while his army on foot moved slowly towards Charlottesville, marching, he was going to send Tarleton on a raid to Charlottesville. And there he hoped to not only destroy supplies, but also to capture or at least disperse the Virginia General Assembly, which had moved there in May from Richmond to get away from the British. So Cornwallis knew that the Virginia House was meeting and that Jefferson would be there, and the Harrisons would be there, and lots of well-known Virginia names and delegates. And he wanted Tarleton to try to capture Jefferson and to prevent the assembly from meeting. And one of the reasons often overlooked by historians is that one of the reasons he wanted to, in his words, disturb the assembly was that only the assembly could provide the funds to support the militia and to call them up for service during this raid and during Cornwallis's campaign and operations in Virginia. And that if he disturbed the assembly, preventing them from meeting, the militia would not mobilize. So he had two reasons there, the other one being to capture Jefferson. So he picked Tarleton to be the commander of this raid, Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton. He was about 24 years old at this time, and he commanded a mixed force of infantry and cavalry called Tarleton's Legion, more accurately known as the British Legion. And these men, some of them were cavalry, some infantry. They wore green uniform coats instead of red. By the time they were in this area, however, they had not been resupplied in quite some time. A lot of them were missing shoes, just like the Americans. Their green coats had been traded in for linen dusters, white linen dusters. They had distinctive cavalry leather helmets with bear fur. It's not really known if they survived this long in the field since 1780. And he picked Tarleton with about 125 to 150 troopers and about 75 infantrymen to ride on the back of the horses, who were from the 23rd Regiment, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. And they took off from Cook's Ford early in the morning on June 3rd and headed out west. And they got onto the road that led to the west there that you can see on the arrows. They got to a tavern in the far western corner of Hanover County and turned south, which you can see on the left-hand side of your map, and rode down across the Newfound River to Scotchtown, which was the name of the plantation previously owned by Patrick Henry before the Revolutionary War for about 10 years or so, and stopped there to refresh themselves, and especially the horses, with water, and turned them into fields to graze. So let's go to the next slide. I'll show you some of these places and what they look like today. This is an image. This is part of what's now Hanover County's North Anna Battlefield Park, and this leads down to the ford. It drops off quite a bit, about 100 or 200 yards beyond where you can see right here. This was part of the 18th century roadbed, but also used during the Civil War as well. And the park is open to the public, and a very pretty place. The next slide shows the image of Tarleton. There's a famous image of Tarleton that you might have seen painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds. It's in the Portrait Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery in London. This one came from a book shortly after the Revolution, published in London, had a lot of the commanders' portraits in there, but this shows the young Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton. And one more slide, which is a picture of, this is the British Legion. This is the only known contemporary image of the British Legion. The image comes from below the portrait I just showed you, but I wanted to separate it out and blow it up a little bit so you can see a little bit of what the uniforms look like, especially with the distinctive headgear. So let's move on one slide. And this is a picture of Scotchtown. And this is a house museum open to the public. It is from about 1719. Patrick Henry was the owner here for about 8 or 9 years, I believe. And he became governor of Virginia in 1776. And in fact, he served right until 1779 when Thomas Jefferson was elected. The Virginia Constitution at that time said the governor could only serve one term of 3 years. And Patrick Henry was the first governor under the 1776 Virginia Constitution. Okay, let's get back to our maps. The next image will show us Tarleton's route. And you can see Scotchtown on the right. After stopping there, here I have Tarleton in blue, just to be able to see it a little bit better in a busy background here. But the troops went down Tarleton's column. Again, now we're talking very early in the morning here, He left Scotchtown and got to a place called Ground Squirrel Bridge, which is on the South Anna River. And if you know the area, it's where US 33 crosses the South Anna between Glen Allen and Montpelier and on into Louisa County. So he got to the Ground Squirrel Bridge, which led him to what was called the Mountain Road or the Louisa Road. After doing a lot of research on this for many, many years, I'm now convinced that other than the Three Chopt Road near the James River, every road from Richmond and Hanover that led to the mountains was called the Mountain Road. So that just depends on where you live. So he turned northwest here, up what is now US 33, heading toward Louisa. This was the closest and best road to get to Charlottesville, but you had to go through Louisa to get there. And I show here on this map to Cuckoo, which is the famous tavern, and we can see that in our next map. If we can get that one pulled up, please. Okay, a little busy here, but stay with me, and I'll guide us through this map. So in the bottom right-hand corner is to Ground Squirrel Bridge. You can see that road, the main road, that dark road that leads from the bottom right corner up toward a place called Cuckoo Tavern. Now, Cuckoo Tavern, it is believed that it was not called Cuckoo Tavern at the time. It was known as by other names depending upon the owner at the time. But when this episode happened in June of 1781, this was owned by the family by the name of Jewett. And a young member of that family, the son of the proprietor, who actually ran the tavern in Charlottesville as well, the Swan Tavern. Tarleton's men got to Cuckoo Tavern at a crossroads at about 9 to 10 p.m. and they watered their horses in a pond or stream nearby. The tavern is right on the road, and the officers, of course, went in and had drinks and libations and were giving the men a rest, the horses a rest. And Jewett happened to be in the tavern and realized that with the size of that force and the direction they had come from, that they were most likely as cavalry headed toward Charlottesville. And in a famous incident where he rode to Monticello to warn Jefferson, he's been called the Paul Revere of the South. He got on his horse and rode through a very seldom used path or trail. It is not known exactly what road or path he used. I've seen it labeled on maps with certainty, but it cannot be said with any degree of with 100% certainty. I'll say that which route Jewett took, but it was not on the same mountain road that Tarleton was on, because he did not want to get captured, and he also thought that the road he took somewhere south of Cuckoo and Louisa Courthouse would be quicker. So after Tarleton and his men rested at Cuckoo Tavern, they continued on the mountain road, which I have an arrow pointing toward, and hopefully you can see that, to Louisa Courthouse. At Louisa Courthouse, they rested. It is not known where in Louisa Courthouse they were. The current courthouse is not the original from the 18th century. And other than Tarleton saying that they stayed for a period of time at about midnight on the night of June 3rd, 4th, other than that, there's no real reference to where they camped at all in this area. On the bottom left of the map, I have Jack Jewett's route. Again, that's just to show you kind of the general terrain he would have followed. It's not known, again, where that was. Now, Tarleton and his men were heading to Albemarle County, And they wanted to go to a part of the county, which, if you know the area, is between Shadwell and Gordonsville. The route number that goes through there is 231 and Route 20. There's many estates still out there. And he had gotten intelligence somehow from either loyalists or runaway slaves who were following him and helping to guide him, that there were some major political figures that were staying in this area around a plantation called Castle Hill. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so the next slide here, this is a little screen grab from a bigger map. You can see again, I won't go over all of this, but you can see where Richmond is on the bottom right. Up on the top right, there's Cook's Ford again, and they went through Hanover to get there. I've labeled Ground Squirrel Bridge on the river, the South Anna River. There's the approximate location of Cuckoo, and then Louisa you can see there. After Tarleton rested at Louisa, he went on the main road that led to the Castle Hill area, which he was going to go through to get to Charlottesville, and again stopped at Boswell's Tavern. Boswell's Tavern was a 1750s tavern, and there he found, in addition to a nice spring pond and a little creek to water the horses, some fields of hay nearby, he also found 10 or 11 wagons full of equipment, arms and other type of camp equipage, some powder, camp kettles, tents, canvas, cavalry furniture, and burned the wagons at Boswell's Tavern on the road that led, what was called the Old Carolina Road, now roughly US 15, right at Boswell's Tavern. That equipment was all heading toward the Southern Army in South Carolina, led by Nathaniel Greene. There's a ridge that he had to cross between Boswell's Tavern and he was heading toward Castle Hill, a very prominent location at the time. And we'll stop the narrative there and take a look at a few pictures of these places that I've taken over the years, and also I've obtained from other sources. So let's have the next slide. This is Boswell's Tavern. This is from the 1750s, although it might be a little bit earlier. It is near the intersection of Virginia 22 and US 15, which runs north-south. It has been for sale over the years. I've taken tour groups to this place and gotten inside it. Several years ago, I was in touch with the owners and were able to tour it inside and out. This last time I went there, didn't look like much was inside. So from the roadway, I discreetly took a picture, but you can see there's no gravel on the driveway anymore. The boxwoods there, many of which go back 200 years or so, a little unkempt. But this is the original building. If you're out that way between Louisa and US 15, it is very close to the road, and if you slow down, you can get a really good look at it. This is a great picture of one of the 18th century buildings in there. All right, let's go to the next image, please. This is Castle Hill, and this sits on the road between Gordonsville and Shadwell that Tarleton was hoping to turn into from Louisa to get to some of these plantation houses. Now, of this house, the white board section that you see, which is 1.5 stories with the dormers in front, that's the original 1764 house. What you see in the back is a totally separate house added on to the back of the 1764 house in the early 19th century, I believe 1830s or 40s, I could be wrong, and they're connected by a two-story hyphen between the two of them. But if you can imagine the place just for what it is there with the clapboard house, that was the home of Thomas Walker. He was a famous explorer, doctor from the 1720s. He went far down into Southwest Virginia. A lot of his maps were used later by Thomas Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, in producing the famous Jefferson Fry map. And Walker's son, whose name escapes me now, was the trustee for Jefferson's estate. If he were to die, he was to be the trustee for him. So a very important place. It was a huge estate, plantation for tobacco. There's several hundred acres still left, much of it in a easement. So this area is those of you who have been there, been to this area know what a pretty place it is. So let's go to the next map and we'll follow Tarleton. So top right, this is a topographical map of the area that we've been talking about. And in the top right of the map, this is where Tarleton came from Louisa over to the main road there that he was going to take down from Castle Hill towards Charlottesville. There's a little place there called Lindley, where at the base of that arrow, and he came over on the Lindley Road, I'm convinced. And you can see the location of Castle Hill there. Tarleton went to Castle Hill very early in the morning, surprised some legislators. He pardoned a few, put them on parole so they could not help the American cause. That way he didn't have to take them with him. He also was able to get some supplies, some food for his men. There's an old story where Mrs. Walker cooked a big breakfast for the troops and convinced them to stay to eat, and therefore delayed them, allowing Jack Jewett, who's riding across the countryside through the brambles and the trees. I don't put any faith in that at all, but you see it in almost every telling of the story in print. So Tarleton rode down the main red road there that you see toward Shadwell. Jewett at some point came out on the Three Chopped Road, which is the main road that went from Monticello and Charlottesville to Richmond. It was along the river, and at some point Jewett had to come out on that road because he crossed the Rivanna River, which you see at the point of the arrow where I have Jewett crossing. That was a place called Milford, and there was a ford there, and it was the easiest way to get to Monticello because he had to cross the Rivanna to get to Monticello to warn Jefferson. So again, we're not quite clear how he got to Three Chopped Road, but he did eventually cross. And Milton is a cute little town on the Rivanna, and you can see from the bridge where the crossing spot is. So Jewett went to Monticello, which is marked on the map. Tarleton, coming down the road from Castle Hill, came over what's now called Pantops Mountain. Everybody who knows Charlottesville knows where Pantops is. That's on the east side of the river. And you can see that he crossed the river where the X is. And if you know Charlottesville, that's basically where Meade Park is. It's along Meade Road at the bottom of 12th Street in modern Charlottesville. And that's on the morning of June 4th. There was a little bit of militia there. They dispersed after a few shots, and Tarleton was able to get to the town. And he was able to disperse the militia, burn some muskets and supplies as well. Before we go on to the rest of the Jack Jewett story, let's go one more map. Okay, again, I've labeled some spots here, but you can see where Castle Hill is. And if you follow the arrow from the C in Castle Hill, the point of the arrow goes near a dot, which is Walker. That's Castle Hill. It was the Walker family owned it. And you can see where the location of Charlottesville was or is still. Okay, can we have the next map, please? All right, again, a little bit more detailed here. Tarleton's coming down from the top right. He moves along, again, no railroads at the time, but this is still one of Hotchkiss's maps. And he moves along over Pantop's Mountain and crosses the road where you can see there that the top left arrow is where he was crossing into Charlottesville. And this map has a better image of Milton. You can see that's where Jewett crossed. And again, he could have come into the Three Chopped Road at any point in western Louisa or eastern Albemarle County. Now, Jefferson was warned by Jewett very early in the morning. So Jewett's mission was accomplished. Jefferson was, Archibald Carey and Benjamin Harrison were staying with him. Those were the leaders of the both houses of the Virginia Assembly. They fled. Jefferson stayed for a while, and Jewett wound up going into Charlottesville to warn the legislature that Tarleton was coming. And most of the legislators escaped. Tarleton was able to capture 6 of those legislators. Jefferson went up to the mountain, Walker's Mountain, which you can see where the mountain is for Monticello. If you look at the word Monticello, you can see the topographical features of another mountain there that's taller than Monticello and had a view into Charlottesville. Jefferson went up there with a spyglass, or what we would call a telescope, and he could see the British riding into Charlottesville. So he knew his time was up. In fact, Tarleton had taken a detachment, or Tarleton ordered a small detachment from Charlottesville up to Monticello to try to capture Jefferson. But by that time, Jefferson had fled. He had sent his family off earlier in the day to a plantation in southern Albemarle County called Blenheim. And Jefferson and his family wound up escaping into Amherst County and then Poplar Forest in Bedford. But this is how Tarleton got into Charlottesville, which you can see on that Civil War era map. Okay, let's go to some pictures if we could. Thomas Jefferson as president at the time, much younger, of course, and he was very much interested in the he was very interested in quitting his term of governor. He had been governor for 2 years. It was very burdensome. Virginia had been invaded in 1779, 1780, and now 1781. The way the Virginia Constitution was set up, it was very difficult for him as a leader to produce a defense. He always had to defer to the government. So when Tarleton's raid hit Charlottesville, his term had been over for 1 day. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end. Let's go to the next slide. Here's the Rivanna River near Charlottesville, close to Milton. And this is where, actually it's closer to where Tarleton crossed the Rivanna River at the ford there. But just shows you it's fairly shallow in the summertime. And Tarleton's men rode across the river with their horses and the infantry behind them. And the next image we'll show you is an image of Monticello. That is not the way Monticello looked in time of the Revolutionary War. This is what it looked like more in the early 19th century, after Jefferson had studied a lot more architecture in France. But this is where Jefferson was and fled from, and that's where Tarleton sent his detachment, which was not successful in capturing Jefferson. Okay, one more picture we'll show you here. And that is this little nondescript house in Charlottesville. It is on a city block near, I believe, Southwest 12th Street. So Tarleton rode into Charlottesville and looking for Jefferson and didn't find him. But as I said before, he did manage to capture all but 6 legislators. This building here, the white building that you see behind the boxwood, the right low section is not 18th century. And sometime long after the Revolution, the upper level was put on. But the basic frame of that large section, 1 story, that was the kitchen building for a plantation known as the farm. And it was a large plantation that went all the way down to the Rivanna River. Over the years, it's been chipped away, and this building is all that's left of the 18th century structures. Now, there is a 19th century pre-Civil War house that was used as the headquarters for the Union cavalry under Custer in 1865. But this is on private property, but this was Tarleton's headquarters. And one of the legislators that he captured was a legislator from a county named Kentucky, which was part of Virginia at the time. And his name, as you probably have guessed, was Daniel Boone. And he was captured, but he wasn't considered a gentleman because he was wearing some pretty rough-looking clothing. He didn't have the air of a gentleman. And so he was not paroled. He was kept a prisoner in the coal house of this farm overnight and even taken down to Cornwallis's headquarters, several down on the James River in Goochland County, before he was released. But this building can be seen from the road, and it's a remarkable survivor. Again, Tarleton not able to capture Jefferson. He wound up going southwest to meet up with Cornwallis on the James River. Cornwallis and another cavalry detachment had destroyed quite a number of weapons and supplies at Point of Fork and in Old Albemarle Courthouse. Lafayette, to come back to our American commander, he wound up retreating up into Orange County and was able to meet up with the forces of General Wayne in Orange County on June 12th. And since he had been reinforced and more militia had joined him, he wound up marching through Boswell's Tavern and down to a place called Mechunk Creek, which is very difficult to find the location, but it can be done. And Lafayette's army took up a blocking position because the Three Chop Road crossed Mechunk Creek, and the American forces were able to block that. And if you go to the next slide, please, this shows the entrenchments that Lafayette's troops, in part, dug at and around the small bridge at Mechunk Creek. And this is on private property. Even people out there in the neighborhood would not know it. It's at the base of some high ground. And since it's private property, I'll just say that it's near the bridge. But this is a remarkable remnant of the entrenchments dug. And if you will go one more slide, please, and hopefully this next slide will illustrate where I'm talking about. You see Charlottesville in the upper right, and just where it crosses the road there, crosses east of Charlottesville, kind of where the A and the R of Charlottesville are straddling the road. That's where Mechunk Creek crosses. Mechunk Creek is, and the road, Three Chopped Road, the road down to Richmond, that's where it crosses. Tarleton went close to that position to scout it out, but he realized that there were now 2,000 Continentals, some scouts, some militia, some riflemen from the Shenandoah, and he decided that he was going to finally retreat. Again, Cornwallis had moved as far west as where you see there, it says Elk Hill. That was a Jefferson family property. That was a Martha Jefferson property, and that Jefferson had, and they never lived there. They wound up selling it later. But Point of Fork, where you see there, is where near modern Columbia in Fluvanna County, and that's where a large depot was, commanded by General Baron von Steuben. He was forced to withdraw. They lost a lot of supplies from there, and the British wound up withdrawing, and if you can follow along the map, from Elk Hill by about the 14th of June to Goochland Courthouse, where you see there on the river, and following the James River Road to Richmond, where the falls are. That's why Richmond is at the fall line, and eventually onto Williamsburg. They reached Williamsburg in late June, early July. Now, what happened to Jefferson? Jefferson was accused shortly after he fled Charlottesville of, for lack of a bit more modern word, a dereliction of duty as governor. So a delegate made a resolution calling for an inquiry into Jefferson's conduct during the various raids in Virginia, because the British were able to march from Norfolk to Portsmouth to Hanover to Charlottesville to Richmond, back down to Williamsburg, and Jefferson was livid at that. And he wound up, I'll shorten the story here, but after he became governor, after he was no longer governor, he got himself elected to the House of Delegates from Albemarle just so he would be in the fall legislative session and defend his name. Now, after the delegates were rousted out of Charlottesville, they reconvened in Stanton, Virginia. And by that time, things had cooled down. The British had left the region. But Jefferson was very upset by this, and to the rest of his days, he was upset by it. He thought Patrick Henry might have been behind some of this, since they were rivals and not really political friends. By the time of Yorktown in 1781, where the British surrendered, kind of all's well that ends well, so there was no real inquiry into this at all. In fact, in the November records of the General Assembly, you don't see anything mentioned whatsoever. But his political enemies in 1800 brought it up again, and it still really irked him 30 years or more after the war. So anyway, that's the story of Tarleton's Charlottesville raid. So one of the questions is one of the French Hager swords made for the Americans lost at the Point of Fork Depot? No, this is a British, I assume you're talking about the sword in the first slide. This is a British dragoon sword that we do have in the museum on display. Let's see, looks like someone went to Jack Jewett Elementary School, maybe. There is one in Louisa County. Whenever we talked about the Revolution, we had plenty of reasons to be patriots, but no one had any to be a loyalist. In your personal opinion, what would drive an American to stay loyal and possibly fight his neighbors for the king? It's a good question. I'll answer it briefly. Mainly because it's not totally related to our story here. Although Tarleton's Legion was a loyalist unit, it was mostly Americans in the unit. Some stayed to protect their property. Some Americans stayed loyal because of their positions, their wealth. Others had, like for example, in North Carolina, many Highland Scots were given land grants by the king and didn't want to lose them. So your question kind of makes me think about trying to come up with some kind of program next year related to the Loyalists. So thank you for mentioning that. Another question, was Steuben being wasted at Point of Fork acting just as a quartermaster? No, he was actually in charge of collecting supplies and also outfitting new Continental troops from Virginia to be added to the forces of Nathanael Greene in North and South Carolina. That's what he had been doing right before the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. He stayed in Virginia, wound up participating in the Yorktown operations, but at the time of Point of Fork, he was more as a head logistician, but also a recruiter, trainer, and kind of shuttling supplies and people down to South Carolina. Did the British have access to maps of Virginia, or do they have to use local guides? How do they know how to get from point to point? Excellent question. And I've looked into that as much as possible. In the papers of Cornwallis and Tarleton, there's no mention of any local guides by name or even how they did find these places. Jefferson's papers, which have been published about this time period, also no mention. My guess is that this part of Virginia was not really a loyalist area. However, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of escaped slaves who joined the British column as they marched all over Virginia, who would have known all the roads, all the trails, the locations of the more prosperous plantations. And so it is not known that Cornwallis had any kind of map other than what Tarleton or Tarleton's other cavalry peer, Simcoe, Lieutenant Colonel Simcoe, would have been able to put together based on where the slaves said that the roads were. Okay, old friend of mine asked, was the depot at Old Albemarle Courthouse? Yes. Was it still active at the time of Simcoe's raid? There was still supplies at the Old Albemarle Courthouse located in Albemarle County, just west of Scottsville. In fact, there's another location beyond that called Seven Islands, based on 7 islands in the James River, that also had supplies that Simcoe was able to attack. Let's see. Cumberland, not Albemarle. Got it. So the Cumberland Courthouse, I do not know. I believe that that's where von Steuben retreated with some of his troops to regroup. They actually moved back to Point of Fork prior to following to Richmond. So one of our guests tonight is essentially wondering if the British accomplished their objective. That's a great question. They were able to destroy a lot of supplies, but did they knock Virginia out of the war? No. And in fact, while Lafayette and Cornwallis were marching with their troops up and down the Piedmont and the Tidewater, that was the same time that Washington and Rochambeau started to be able to put together the Yorktown campaign due to the anticipated presence of the French fleet off the American coast. So they were not really able to knock Virginia out at all. A great question. Tarleton is often portrayed as a war criminal. Is that true? That's our next question. Well, if you've seen the movie The Patriot, where Tarleton is Tavington, you would believe that. Tarleton was a hard-hitting, brash, young officer who did not really have any sympathies for the Americans or the American cause. There were several episodes that are kind of beyond the scope of tonight's talk, Lanude's Ferry, the Waxhaws, that gave Tarleton a very negative reputation among Americans. But one thing I would stress is that this wasn't a war between the British and the French, or the Prussians and the Austrians. This was a rebellion. And Tarleton was not the only very tough British officer during the war. You can point to No Flint Gray or General Grant of the British Army. And Tarleton was not going to jeopardize the niceties of people in rebellion against the king for success. He wanted success. So hopefully that answers the question a little bit. I think we've had a few biographies come out recently about Tarleton, and you can look into those if you'd like. Another old friend of mine asks, can you relay the story that Tarleton supposedly rode his horse through Patrick Henry's Scotchtown? There are staircases on either side of the main hall leading outside. Do you think it could be possible that he did so? And I'm sure the story also says that there were saber marks on the banisters going down the hallway. So to answer that question, in my research of Tarleton and Virginia and the Yorktown campaign, I've come across 5 stories with 5 different houses that all claim that Tarleton rode the horse up the staircase and back down, slashing as he went. Most people who are knowledgeable about horses know that it wouldn't really be a good idea to ride your horse up and down the staircase at the same time, slashing away at the banisters. It serves no purpose. It could be dangerous, and it sounds like a myth to me. So I don't really put much faith in that. Okay, well, that looks like, well, we've got one. Can you describe Tarleton's destruction of Elk Hill? Elk Hill was the plantation that we showed in the last slide on the map. Tarleton did not destroy Elk Hill. Cornwallis did. For most of this time, Cornwallis was not at Elk Hill. In fact, even while Cornwallis was moving along the river road back toward Richmond, Tarleton was on the Three Chopt Road. And that was north of the river road. So he really did not have much of an opportunity to do anything along those lines. The British handled that pretty well. There's one question I wanted to try to get to. Let me see. Well, it looks like I can't find it now. I believe it was the number of prisoners. The number of prisoners Tarleton reported and that I found was 6. I've seen one source that says 7. There is no roster of them other than that Daniel Boone was one of them. So if you can find any direct information, that would love to hear it. But great question. There was a lot of information I was looking for in this that was not in any source, but one source above all others was a diary by a man named Robert Honeyman, and I can't recall now whether he was a minister or a lawyer or a doctor, but he was staying out at a tavern between Cooksford and Scotchtown, where Tarleton passed through, and he actually reported in his diary that was published by, I believe, the William and Mary Quarterly long, long ago, and he relates his conversation with Tarleton, what his men looked like, what Tarleton's demeanor was, and it was basically the closest thing I've really seen to what we would have as a live on TV interview today with a celebrity, because the detail is so fascinating, and you just don't get that with all revolutionary figures, particularly a lieutenant colonel rather than a general. So let me see if we have a few more questions. I'd be happy to answer them. What's the documentation for Three Chopt Road for the 18th century? The name I've seen on most contemporary documents is Three Notched Road or Three Notched Trail. That's a good question. The closer you get to Charlottesville, the more it becomes called the Three Notched Road. But from Richmond through Henrico along the river out through Goochland, it's almost, well, from the river, I mean the start of that road is really where the Country Club of Virginia is, near the Huguenot Bridge. But the road goes up into Henrico County, Goochland County, west, and at the time, their letters and even some maps refer to the Three Chopped Road, not the Three Notched Road. But I believe the Three Notched Road would have been common for the Charlottesville area. Thank you for somebody Jim Gallagher, thank you for pointing out that Honeyman was a doctor from Hanover. So that's very helpful. Okay, folks, that's it for tonight. Thanks again, as always. And again, great chat, great questions, and contact me if you need to. And with that, I'll say good night and hope to see you at a future program.